Many years ago, almost a quarter century ago, I was in my first year of graduate school, and the building our department was housed in, it was right next door to the building where, I guess, the biology lab, or it might have been the psychology department where that was housed. And we would step outside occasionally. This is far enough back that you could actually smoke on college campuses so long as you didn't do it in the building. And I've never smoked in my life, but a number of my friends did smoke. So sometimes we would step outside just to take a break and just have a chat, get a little fresh air and sunshine, although I guess for them it wasn't very fresh air. But one day, I remember we were caught up in our conversation, and all of a sudden a rat ran by, and then a second one, and then a third one, all very quickly together. And I about jumped out of my skin, because this is not something I saw coming. And they had to tell me, well, with that lab over in that building right next door, sometimes the rats get loose. And I open up with that story really to make the point that there are large parts of the world, and in history there have been even larger parts, where if you mention dog, people responded to it the way I responded to rat. Now, if anyone who's listening to this has pet rats, then this reference isn't going to work at all. But I would assert that for a critical mass of people living in the United States today, that if you think about a rat, if you were outside on a public street on a nice day and you saw a rat, you would think, I want to get away from that thing. You might think about disease, about the danger of being bitten, that if there are rats around, then there's a problem with sanitation. And in the United States in 2017, you don't really typically get that impression. People in the United States certainly don't when you mention dogs. But throughout a large part of the world, that's exactly the impression that dogs make. Dogs are dirty. Dogs are dangerous. If I am not mistaken, and I didn't really fact check this, but I believe the teaching throughout much of the Muslim world is that you shouldn't have pet dogs because that's a sign of not being clean. And I do know that in the time of the Bible, there is an episode where Jesus meets a Syrophoenician woman, and she asks him if he can heal her daughter. And Jesus says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And she asks again, and he says, it's not right to take the food from the table from the children and feed it to the dogs. And that makes for a great discussion in a sermon, because that is an unbelievably harsh thing for Jesus to say, because the people of the day did not have the same attitude about dogs that people in the United States have toward dogs. So my first premise that I want to set up here is a whole lot of people that I come in contact with every day, and that quite likely you come in contact with every day, the reference and any opportunity to think about a dog is a good thing. And that's going to be the thrust of what I talk about today, the general positive regard that we have for dogs that I think might have gotten a little bit out of balance, and that I think in some sense is a Rorschach test, in some sense is diagnostic about how we feel about relationships in general. And it's to make the point that that is not inevitable. That is not the default. That's a sign that something is happening. For much of American history, you might have a dog in your household, but the odds were, if you did, it was probably a working dog. And the odds were that your children would befriend the dog, because children will try to make out of just about anything in their environment a toy. And so if a dog is willing to play, if a dog is willing to fetch a ball, then a child sees a play opportunity. And so the cultural framing of dogs was, dogs are there to serve a purpose. If you're on the farm, dogs have work, and dogs may be herding animals. And if your children like to play with the dog, well, that's what children do. But an adult who spent too much time indulging or playing with a dog probably didn't have their priorities very straight. It's also the case that back then, even in the period after the critical mass of Americans moved off the farm and moved into the city, or at least moved into towns, maybe not big metropolitan cities, but decent-sized towns, if you did have a dog as the member of the household, it was still uncomplicated and fairly low maintenance. I am a little bit of a follower of Patricia McConnell. I've read a couple of her books and enjoyed them. it's a good way to think about communication that crosses species boundaries, to read what she has to say about how to train animals and how to communicate with animals. And she had a blog post within the past couple of weeks where she talked about, or actually I think it may have been a discussion in one of her books, she said that when she was a kid and they had a pet dog, the way the dog got enough exercise was at the beginning of every day, her mother would just open the door and the dog would go roam the neighborhood. The dog would pick up a couple of neighbor dogs and they would just kind of wander around. And as children walked to school and came home, the children would pet the dogs and play with the dogs. And the dogs would find things to get into, to sniff and explore. And generally they were regarded as kind of benign. And you couldn't do that today. For one thing, there are fewer and fewer neighborhoods where children walk to or from school because that, to people today, does not seem safe. And maybe that's another episode, that we have a perception of danger that doesn't necessarily match measurable reality. Maybe that's one for down the road. But letting your dog wander wild now seems so deviant. It's the kind of thing that would get animal control called. But back then, it was just normal. It was just what you did. Today, you would be running the risk that your dog would get hit by a car, or that people would feel alarmed at the sight of your dog, or they might have a dog who didn't respond well to other dogs and would therefore try to fight your dog. And a lot of that, I think McConnell would explain that as we keep our dogs so bottled up in our houses, and we get them so little stimulation and so little freedom that a lot of them are just powder kegs of mismanaged dog instincts. And so there was a time when dogs occupied people's... Dogs were you could find dogs as members of households, but they didn't have to... They didn't need as much maintenance. They didn't need as much constant care. You didn't need a dog walker. The idea that you would hire a dog walker, that there would be such a thing as dog daycare, really the idea that you would spend money on dog food, or that you would spend money on dog toys, or dog training, or that you would have time in your schedule for dog play dates, all of that would have seemed really, really crazy. But look, and try to look with fresh, mindful eyes at the world around you in 2017. And what I see when I look around is I see more and more people who say that dogs, they prefer dogs to people. That they would rather have a relationship with a dog than with a person. And there are more and more people, there's more and more slang being adopted. They call it their pupper or their doggo. There are more and more married couples that will get dogs and then call them their furry kids. And I'm not against dog ownership. One thing that my students get used to is you can find on the internet live cams that look at litters of puppies. And I put the puppy cam up all the time because I like to watch puppies, and I find that it's actually kind of a good way to break tension and manage stress a little bit. So I show it to my students because college students are under a fair amount of stress. I am I approve of puppies. I approve of older dogs. I actually have a soft spot in my heart for older dogs. They're very fun to play with because they have the same playful spirit, but people give them less attention. And so I have seen a whole lot of old dogs in my time look as though they are pleasantly surprised when I want to play with them, because it's been a few years since they could draw a crowd the way they could when they were puppies. Now, what I did just right there is something that I see people do a lot with dogs, which is to say, I anthropomorphized the dog. I speculated on how a dog thought, how a dog felt, based on what I observed, and I translated it into what that would mean if a human being did it. So I look at a dog perk up, and I think the dog is pleasantly surprised. And I don't know, I think that's probably a slightly more complex mix of emotions than your typical dog is going to have. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's... Dogs can be surprised, no question. And dogs can be surprised and afraid, or dogs can be surprised and happy. So I guess pleasantly surprised works for a dog. But the point is, there are a lot of people who will look at an expression on a dog's face and they will say, oh, look, the dog is smiling. And sometimes it is the case that a relaxed mouth on a dog means that the dog feels safe, content, that the dog is engaged in what's going on. And so happy might be a good rough representation of the dog's experienced reality. But other times, a dog will have done something that the owners told it not to do, and the owners will swear up and down that the dog looks guilty, when it's actually quite well established. Dogs do not feel, and if they do feel, they definitely don't express guilt. Instead, what they feel is they feel a simple primary emotion. They feel fear. And they know that their owner is using dominance behaviors, and so therefore what they have learned they should do in that situation is show submission behaviors. And so if something happened in the house that they had nothing to do with, but their owner thinks that they did it, and their owner makes angry noises, they'll go into submission behaviors, because that's what you do in a dog script. If the alpha dog in the pack is showing dominance behaviors, you placate the alpha dog by showing submission behaviors. But we look at that and we say, the dog knows it did something wrong. Look how guilty it feels. Now, that one example is just to illustrate the principle. What we try to do is we try to turn dogs into miniature humans, because the more they resemble humans, the more they operate like humans, the more they think and feel like humans, the more they are suitable candidates for us to have relationships with. Now, I've said the word dog so many times that it may be sort of turning into repetitive noise and fading into the background. Let me turn aside and digress here for a minute by telling a true story. Back when I was in high school, I actually made it all the way to 9th grade, and I had never in my life really earned money for anything other than being a member of the household and doing chores. So I was 14 years old and still had an allowance. And my mother one day said to me, that is too old for you to have an allowance. I have found you a job. And I said, I don't like the sound of this. What kind of job? And she said, you are going to work in the church nursery 2 nights a week with small children. And I said, I'm not going to do that. I can't stand small children. They make noise. They throw tantrums. I'm not going to do that. And she said, it's that or fast food. And I said, small children don't sound so bad. So I went off for my first night at the nursery, and they put me in with the 4-year-olds. And the 4-year-olds were reasonably manageable. And after a couple of nights with the 4-year-olds, they said, we need someone to work with the 2-year-olds. And I had heard terrible twos, strong-willed. And they put me in there, and at the end of the night, I was still in one piece. And I had found something I never would have guessed about myself. I had real chemistry with 2-year-olds. Something about the way that they reasoned, something about the way they behaved made sense to me. I could almost predict when a kid was going to turn stubborn or when a kid was going to get upset. And I really had a way with the kids who were caught in the throes of separation anxiety, and I could get them calmed down. Their parents would leave, and they would start crying like a car alarm, and I could soothe them down. And so over the next 4 years, I worked 2 nights a week with the 2-year-olds, and it was the first money I had ever earned outside the family household. I say all of that to say, the other thing I discovered, apart from the fact that I had kind of a knack for working well with 2-year-olds, I discovered that that actually was, in some sense, the therapy. It was in some sense the balm or the relief for the everyday storm of relationships, because I was in high school. And some people love high school, some people despise high school, but the one thing you gotta say is the blend of relationships in high school, it's messy, because you're in transition, you're out of childhood, you're even out of the early, ugliest parts of adolescence and middle school, but still, it's very, very ramshackle. It's very, very improvisational. You're still getting a feel for how to treat other people. And I don't want to overestimate how tidy and neat relationships are later on in life, because I still think that they're pretty improvised today and that we go by feel and trying to figure one another out. But in high school, It's very, very common for people to do it in a clumsy way. And in any given day, I would think about the number of different people that I was in hot water with and the number of relationships that were not going well and that I needed to do something different. But then 2 nights a week, I could go into this little room with lots of toys in it and lots of tiny people, and I just did some real simple things. I got down on the floor and played with them with the toys, and I was consistent with the rules, and I kept calm when they got stubborn, and pretty soon I had little 2-year-olds throwing their little stubby arms around my neck and saying, "I wub you," and coming up with cute variations of my name. And it was so uncomplicated. The people that I dealt with every day, that was complicated. The little 2-year-olds 2 nights a week, that was uncomplicated. Now, to take this all the way back to the obsession of having a relationship with a dog, it's uncomplicated. And you have a lot more control. You don't have to address the dog as an equal. You don't have to negotiate with the dog. I mean, you do a little bit. There are some behaviors that dogs are going to engage in that it is difficult to impossible to train them completely out of. A better way to put it might be to say, with dogs, you have to be patient. But with another human being, you have to go further than just being patient. You sometimes have to let them have their way. They sometimes say to you explicitly that you have to choose not to do what you want. And for the relationship to work, there will be occasions when you have to give in and do it the way that they say. And that is a bending, that is a required flexibility that I will assert goes beyond merely being patient. There's a concept that I read a couple of fairly interesting essays about a number of years ago, and then I went looking to see what its research pedigree was, and it was not very distinguished, so I talk about it less and less. But the concept, it was called psychological neoteny, and I think I have brought it up before. If not, it doesn't matter whether I have or whether I haven't. I'm going to run through the concept again and then make a point about it. Neoteny is a real simple concept. You can tell the difference between an adult face and a baby face. You can tell the difference between an adult dog's face and a puppy's face because the differences in features, the larger eyes, the smaller bone structure, a puppy has a shorter muzzle, a baby has a smaller nose, all of those, the word for that is neotenous. When you look at those, you can tell that life form, whether it's a baby, a dog, a cat, a horse, a bird. In any of those, you can tell that it's young by what its features look like. So that's the concept of neoteny. Well, the concept of psychological neoteny, it was a description, it was a profile of a psychology that was characteristic of someone who had not moved on to adulthood. So the way this was argued, people who were psychologically neotenous, they held on to psychological concepts associated with childhood. And so they did not close down their belief system into having a foundation. The argument was that people who move psychologically into adulthood, they know what they believe and they know what they want. And so they continue to learn, they continue to interact with other people and to grow their understanding of the world, but they do it at a much, much slower rate. You know how small children have that spooky way of being able to hear something and then parrot it back word for word because their brains are still sponges? The argument was, at some point, your brain is no longer a sponge. Your brain hardens a little bit. You have arranged it into shape. You have configured it through the period of childhood and adolescence, and now that you're an adult, you want more of it to be firm. You want more of it to hold up under pressure. So, adults tend to be emotionally less mercurial. Adults tend to work at things that seem to be more meaningful and have higher stakes. Adults do more carrying out of needed tasks, and they do less playing. And that word right there, playing. Playing is what's characteristic of psychological neoteny. Now, when I first read the essays that made this argument, it was back during the years of the dot-com boom. And it was becoming more and more common that respected professionals who were making a lot of money, They would have toys on their desk. They would work in an office where there would be a pool table. There might be a slide to get from floor to floor. There might be a ping pong table and pinball games. You go back to the 1950s, the 1960s, and you were at an engineering firm or you were at a law firm, and you weren't going to find any of those. You didn't find those in adult workplaces. The idea that you would play, that was an idea, that was the kind of behavior that was appropriate for children. And I think I did talk about psychological neoteny many, many weeks ago when I had the episode on youth. But the thing about psychological neoteny, the argument that got made in connection with that was the world is now changing so much faster that technological change in how communication works, it happens in waves that wash over us so much more frequently, so much more quickly than in the past, that if you get to the age of majority, if you get to the end of your teenage years and into your 20s, and you slow down and you make rigid your faculty for learning new things, then you're not going to succeed as an adult. And the argument was that the pressure to continue to be very, very open to learning radical new things that completely rewrote your view of the world, that was why so many people had toys on their desks. That was why there were so many men who followed the man-child mode. That's why there were so many women who their only concept of enjoying friendship with others was to make jokes out of everything. Because if play was the dominant frame for the world, then you were more flexible, more on your toes to confront the unexpected and to learn rapidly. And I think something like that is at work here. There's an argument that dogs are actually just wolves who, through natural selection, have lost the ability to become adult wolves. And one of the things that is true of dogs is throughout their lifespan, they continue to play. Whereas in a lot of different types of animals, they'll play when they're young, but when they become fully adult, they stop playing. So lambs will run all over the place, but when they become fully grown sheep, they don't play. They may interact with one another. Mostly they graze and go about their business. They may have favored other sheep to be near, but they lose the habit of playing. And adult wolves, this also comes out of Patricia McConnell, by the way, adult wolves don't play. They're not going to play fetch. They don't play wrestle with one another. They may tolerate a wolf pup playing with them. They may even get into the game a little bit for the purpose, we speculate the purpose, of teaching the wolf pup how to operate cooperatively with the rest of the pack. But in all those other species, it's children that play, and it stops, it slows and stops when you get to adulthood. So here we are. We talk more and more about dogs and about how we prefer dogs, honestly, to people. About how people suck, but dogs are wonderful. We shrug when we hear that there were violent crimes, downright atrocities committed against people. But if someone abuses a dog, if someone is cruel to a dog, oh gosh, people will take to the streets with torches. And we anthropomorphize so many things that we see dogs doing. We say that dogs love us unconditionally. No, they really don't. We say that dogs bond to people for life. Actually, most dogs who get rehomed, if the home is a peaceful place where they're accepted, they do fine within a few days. But we continue to cherry pick what we observe to try to make it look as though the relationship with the dog is more satisfying and more suitable because it's a relationship where there's less complexity and there's more control. And here's what I think. I think that we find loss of control aversive but tolerable. Loss of control is not a lot of fun. It can be too intense. But it's tolerable if there's a limit to it. And the more lack of control escalates, the more what we will feel driven to do is to adjust other factors to try to restore some measure of control. And the wave of changes that we have lived through in the past few decades, other people have become less predictable. And the more unpredictable they are, what comes with the unpredictability is loss of control. When you can no longer trust your own eyes, when you can't trust photos because photos are photoshopped, when rules of social conduct that you grew up with are in very, very fundamental and radical ways being discarded, being rewritten, then loss of control escalates and grows to the point where people will take, in some cases, severe steps to try to feel in control again. And people will pull back from other people. People will become very selective in their willingness to enter relationships with other people, and all of a sudden dogs are looking really good. Unlike much of the rest of the world, when mentioning a dog is like mentioning a rat. I think I've talked before about some of the research that showed up in the 1990s about Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone book, The Loss of Social Capital, the fact that more and more people said that they didn't have even a single close friend that they could tell anything at all to, whereas in generations past, people very commonly said they had 2 or even 3 close friends. And there were a lot of public institutions, there were bowling leagues, there were group singing events. If you lived in a community, you could find places where people got together and enjoyed one another's company, and now almost all those institutions are gone. Just the other day I was looking at, there's a Masonic lodge just a couple hundred feet from where I live, and so I looked it up, and I looked at the pictures of the members, and they're all gray and elderly, and it looks like this may be the last generation that Masonic lodge exists. And I think that for a lot of people living today, those relationships just became too complicated. A while back, I wrote a long Facebook post. I occasionally do that when I get an idea that I want to run with, saying that I think it wouldn't surprise me that much if my grandchildren's generation, if I had grandchildren, maybe my great-grandchildren's generation, if they had the same obsession over stuffed animals that people do today over dogs. Because a stuffed animal is going to test your patience even less. And a stuffed animal, you're not going to have to make any concessions to. And maybe as people continue to feel a loss of control, that's the direction the pressure will push them in. And if you think about it right now, if you imagine adults walking around with stuffed animals and talking about their deep, meaningful relationship with their stuffed animal, that sounds absurd, doesn't it? But you don't have to go too far back in the United States, I think, to find the period in history when adults, married adults, talking about their dog as their furry child would have sounded in full measure just as absurd. And when the field upon which interpersonal relationships operates, when it becomes that fraught, when it becomes that hazardous, that high maintenance, that dogs comparatively look so much better, look so much more attractive, then that, I think, that's a civic environment in which engaging with other people, trying to deliberate on different, difficult issues, trying to do so authentically, not in a manipulative fashion, not determined to bring about the outcome you want, not determined to maximize your own wealth and your own power, but to coexist with other people and to be their neighbor, and to sometimes let them win and let them take the lead because the relationship is more important. I'm almost at a loss for how do we get back to an understanding of community where that seems like a worthy objective when just having simple interpersonal relationships seems so risky, so potentially painful, that you're better off going and getting a pet. I think I remember it being written about the time Bill Clinton ran into hot water and got impeached during his presidency. There was a common saying in Washington, D.C., if you want a friend in this town, get a dog. And that's a saying that had been around for a very, very long time. But it's a saying that went from being bitter and sarcastic to, I'm afraid, today being a little bit more of a reality. So I don't know where I go from this. I don't know whether I go to perceived danger from this. But it is a big problem, and it's a big problem that I think it would take a breakthrough of genius to overcome. So, I hope someone's got that in the pipeline.